Good evening. My name is Camille Wilder, and I'm an Assistant Director for Community Relations in the External Department here at Baylor. And on behalf of External Affairs and Multicultural Affairs, I want to welcome you to our AAPI panel this evening. Leadership panels bring together and highlight Waco area leaders for discussions relevant to our students and local community members. I'm very excited about our diverse group of panelists tonight, and I'm excited about hearing from them. I'd now like to introduce to you our moderator for this evening, Caleb Eliezer.
Thank you, Camille. I'm actually going to go ahead and get it seated. Thank you all for attending our third annual Asian Pacific American Heritage Month Leaders Panel. To reintroduce myself, my name is Caleb Eliezer, and I serve as the chair of the Coalition for Asian Students, which is Baylor's organizing body for the Asian student organizations. Okay, can everyone hear me better now? Okay, should I repeat that? Essentially, the coalition largely works to facilitate community, collaborate on events like this one, and advocate for improvements in the quality of Asian student life on campus. This Asian Pacific American Heritage Month panel will focus on better understanding the Asian American identity. According to the Pew Research Center, the pan-ethnic term Asian American describes a population of about 22 million people living in the United States who trace their roots to more than 20 countries in East and Southeast Asia, as well as the Indian subcontinent. As you can imagine, this diversity comes with a unique set of challenges, but our leaders panel gives us the opportunity to learn from members of our community that have gone through these same struggles and grappled with these same questions. With that being said, I'd like to introduce our panelists for tonight. From left to right, our first panelist is Dr. Stephanie Tang. Dr. Tang is a second-generation Taiwanese American and professor at Baylor Law. She received her BA in psychology and legal studies from Northwestern University and her JD from the University of Illinois College of Law. Prior to coming to Waco, Dr. Tang worked as a family law attorney in Chicago, and she is currently part of the Asian Leaders Network core team, as well as a faculty advisor for Baylor's Asian American Law School Association. Our second panelist is Jamie Wong Besa. Jamie Besa of Designs with Jamie is a Baylor alum, teacher, and art entrepreneur. Her vision in creating is to remind individuals of their inherent value and the value of others around them. She also hopes her art educates people about the value of different communities and cultures. Next, we have Dr. Mukesh Kumar. Dr. Kumar is the director of the Waco Metropolitan Planning Organization working on Waco's infrastructure developments. He received his PhD in urban studies and affairs from Cleveland State University. Prior to coming to Waco, Dr. Kumar taught urban and regional planning as an associate professor at Jackson State University. He also worked as a city planner in Jackson, Mississippi, and later took over as the city's director of planning and development. Last but certainly not least, we have Jaja Chen. Jaja is a second-generation Taiwanese American practicing therapist and social worker in Waco. She received her bachelor's and later master's in social work from Baylor University. Jaja is also the co-owner of the boba tea company Cha Community and the founder of Waco's Asian Leaders Network. If you guys will all join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists for being here tonight. I'm so excited to hear from you guys. I'm sure we all have a lot to learn. Before we begin, I'd like to lay out the general workflow for our questions tonight. The questions are structured to flow from inward, related to introspection, to those related to the community, and how we can have it impact outwards. Our goal is to better understand who we are and where we come from, and then learn how we can impact others. There are three main rounds of questions that we hope to address tonight. Round one, which asks how can we more deeply understand our cultural identity as Asian Americans. Round two, which asks how we can better foster community as Asians. And round three, which asks how can we best advocate for racial equity in our own community. For each question, I will ask each individual panelist either the aforementioned general question or a more specialized question related to your background. But for clarity's sake, if I ask you guys the more specific question, you have insights on the general question, please feel free to share this as well. With that said, let's just jump right into it. starting with the far right and our first round of questions, I'd like to ask Jaja and Dr. Kumar, what are some ways that we can better and more deeply understand our cultural identity as Asian Americans?
Yeah, so, I think one of the first things that really helped me learn more about my own Asian identity and background was just starting to dig deeper into the history of my own family. And that wasn't until I'd say college or early young adult, really starting to appreciate the stories from my grandparents and great grandparents that were still alive at the time. Because, as a child, I was I think just kind of taking those stories for granted and more so wanted to diminish my heritage. And so just starting with the stories and just finding out, okay, where did my ancestors come from? How did they even come to Taiwan? That heritage has been so rich and huge. And so much of that for my family has been even around food in particular. So making food and then also hearing the stories from those relatives.
I migrated here in 1996, and the first state I landed in was Iowa. And the first time I became aware of my identity was actually when I got stopped by a police officer. And the person asked me if I was speeding, and I said, I don't think I was, but if you say I was, then probably I was. And so what would you like me to do? And the police officer said, well, you were driving very fast. I said, well, I said, yes, possibly I was. I have no way I could argue against it. And so the person said, what do you do? And I said, I go to college here. And then the person said, did you change anything in your car? Or so there was anything wrong with your car? And I suddenly remember I changed my tires. And I told the police officer that I had recently changed my tire. And he said, oh, maybe you put the wrong size of the tire. And that's why you did not know you're speeding. And so I'll just give you a warning and I'll let you go. He let me go. I went back and then I was having a conversation with some people and I mentioned to them that last night I got stopped by a police officer at night, and the police officer let me go. I have no idea what happened. And then the person said, well, they probably thought you were black, but once they got close to you, they realized you weren't quite black, but they couldn't really figure out what to do with you. And so they tried to simply get out of the entire situation so that they didn't have to do anything to you. So they looked for an excuse so that they could let you go. And so they let you go with a warning. It doesn't even matter what happened. But that was really the first time when I got this sense that this idea of an identity that is directly based on how you look, how you present yourself is not only real, but for the first time, I actually became quite aware of it. And since then, of course, as we discuss more, we'll hopefully explore some of these ideas some more. But that was the very first time I became quite aware.
Moving on to the specific questions for this round. Jamie, you found success as an artist, but we very often don't commonly see members of the Asian community in creative fields. That being said, art is still an important part of culture. So how do you think we can better connect with the Asian identity through art and challenge the surrounding stigma?
I really love this question because we are often talking about representation in different fields. We want to see Asian American representation in media. We want to see it in different occupations, and art is no different. I think art is really a reflection, an expression of people's realities, what they're experiencing. And so it's really important because if you think about Asian Americans, there's very little in history that is created specifically by Asian Americans because a lot of us are creating history right now. A lot of us have parents that are immigrants, and we can, of course, look at art from thousands of years ago in China and feel some kind of, we can resonate with it, we can connect with it, but as specifically Asian Americans in this, as Asians in America in this time, we're creating history. And I think art is a really important piece of expressing that and of sharing that in this historic moment. And so I think it's really special. But as you said, it's not very common. And I think for a lot of us, our parents, when they immigrated to America, had to choose paths that were more practical to create a path for us to be able to achieve our dreams. And I think that's really special. And we get to take advantage of that and pursue things that we're passionate about. as Caleb mentioned earlier, I'm a teacher by day, so art is a side hobby and my passion, but I really enjoy getting to share my story through this. And I think there can be a stigma with not wanting to make people feel uncomfortable or not want to, encroach on what is already the status quo in society. And when I actually started my art career, I didn't really create anything Asian related at all. I wanted to think of what resonates with people, what would people like, what's already out there, and just go along with that. But as I was actually at an Asian Leader Network meeting, I had someone there challenge me, like, I really think you need to start creating things that are true to your culture and to your identity, because it's not about, making something that everyone's necessarily going to like, but it's inviting people into your story. And so from that time, I was like, all right, like, let's give it a go. If no one likes this, that's okay. I do. And it's a part of my story and I'm able to share that with others. So I created some for Mid-Autumn Festival and really got to just connect to my heritage in the ways that I used to celebrate when I lived in Taiwan. And that was really special. So I think realizing that your identity, whether it be Asian American or otherwise, is a gift to get to share with other people instead of a burden you're imposing on others. We're not coming out of superiority or like, you have to align to my story, but more of a invitation to let people into your experiences, and your expression of your identity is a way that we can challenge that stigma and instead make it something beautiful, more powerful as a gift to share.
That was really insightful. Thank you, Jamie. For our next specific question, Dr. Tang, one thing that I found really interesting about your background was that you served as a family law attorney prior to coming to Baylor Law. Cultures surrounding family and norms are certainly different in Asian households. How have you seen these structures play out in your career, and how can we leverage these structures to better understand our cultural identity?
Sure, thanks. I think the biggest thing is that a lot of the times we have this kind of Western conception of individualism and then the Eastern conception of collectivism. So, and I saw a lot of that manifest both in the family structures of clients that I was dealing with. So multi-generational households, people living with their grandparents, having grandparents do a lot of the childcare for while the parents worked, and having a lot of help between multiple generations. And a lot of the judges not really understanding, like, I don't get why all these people are involved in raising your child. Why do we have the neighbor here and your grandma and the grocery store owner and all these people around? This must mean that you're a negative parent, or you're a bad parent, or you're incapable of parenting. And I think that was really startling to me, because as someone who grew up with a lot of support, with a lot of people in our community, a lot of people over a lot during my childhood, I just thought that was normal. I thought this was just kind of the way that people raise children. And I think being able to kind of advocate and help educate people who may not understand this kind of multi-generational way of living, or the togetherness aspect, is really important from a kind of advocacy perspective in general. But more so than that, I think understanding that there's a lot of ways that that manifests itself. So in financials, on the financial side, a lot of the times we'd have clients who also held assets with their parents or with other people, or they had a collective group with their church. Again, things that I thought growing up were all just kind of normal ways of holding things. And I think the judges that I appeared in front of, primarily not being Asian, really opened my eyes to say, like, this isn't what the law provides. I don't really understand what to do. So I think a lot of my advocacy for my Asian clients was education. At the end of the day, was telling the judge, this is what everyone in this community that my client is living in is in a multi-generational household. Everyone, all the kids all play together, all the parents all get together on a regular basis, and all of the people in the surrounding community have kind of assets pulled together because they help each other in this way. And they don't have the promissory notes. They don't have these kind of traditional, again, kind of the Western individual ideals, and lack of trust to just be very generally broad. But I think that coming to that realization was the first step of me being able to advocate, because realizing that there is a disconnect between how people raise their children, how people hold assets, how people manage finances, was an important first step for me to kind of get to that, the next step of the advocacy.
Oh, great. I'd like to now move on to the second round of questions. Thank you guys for your insights. These questions will actually all be specialized and related to your background. But for clarity, again, the general guiding question is, how can we best foster community as Asians? And not to double call on you, Dr. Tang, but this time we'll start with Dr. Tang and move to the right. Dr. Tang, you relatively recently moved to Waco from Chicago. I know myself and many other students are from out of state and might find it difficult to adjust. What are some ways that you helped foster community in Chicago, and how can we translate those initiatives to environments where diversity may look different, like in Waco?
Well, I will say in Chicago, it was much less of a deliberate effort. It wasn't like everything had a specialized group. We had, even in just the lawyer community, we had Chinese lawyers, Korean lawyers, Japanese lawyers, and the Asian American lawyers. So we had multiple different interest groups kind of already existing. We didn't have to form them. So within those groups, though, I think the most effective thing was transparency. And in terms of advocacy, just making sure that everyone started at the same, on a level playing field. So for example, a lot of the legal forms are translated into Spanish, which is great. That's a really good first step. But a lot of the times, within the communities that I served in Chinatown and Chicago or otherwise, they didn't have access to forms translated in their language. And I think Jaja and I both have kind of talked about this in terms of forming the Asian Leaders Network, is how there are so many different denominations of Asian. How do we make sure that everyone at the very minimum understands what we're doing? And the part of that is even just like a language thing, just making sure that they understand from the get-go, this is what we're doing, and has the ability to access that. And I think that's a really important first step, is opening the access to those communities, and making sure that everyone is, if possible, aware. And then I think, again, not to be, I think I've made some generalizations today, and I apologize for that, but just generally, I think the one general trait is that a lot of Asians are less likely, they're more passive in terms of kind of getting out there, being active in the community without knowing someone first. And so I think it's our responsibility in some regard to reach out that hand and say, here, I'm going to this event, will you come with me? And then they know there's kind of the individual person that will like reach out to them and invite them to something so that they can build that community. And from there, I think then we can foster more community interaction.
Oh, yeah, it's really true. And I definitely see that play out on campus. Moving on to our next question. Jamie, as a Baylor grad, which I will soon be, so this question is so deeply important to me. How do you think that Baylor's Asian students can foster community on campus? And how can we continue to connect with our community after leaving Baylor?
When I was at Baylor, I remember I was just involved in so many organizations. Like, college students have a special capacity to just be a part of an incredible amount of things. But I do remember, unfortunately, that one of the things I didn't prioritize as much was actually my cultural organizations. So I was always at every single, event for my School of Education major. I was always there for community service, the things that make it on the transcript. But I think really connecting with people in your community that are from similar backgrounds is really encouraging, but also making ways to bridge community, even within the Asian American overhead community. Like you were saying, there's like 14 different student organizations here, which is incredible, all Asian of some sort. And I think it was always so encouraging to be at like a VSA event and see all the students from KSA come, or everyone decide to show up to Gateway to India together. I think making those connections and bridging between even different Asian cultures is really important, and having that attitude of wanting to learn and to connect. I think sometimes it can feel scary to let other people in. We want to be with what's familiar, be with what's comfortable. But the only way that we can build genuine relationships and community is by having those friendships and allowing people to experience what it's like within our communities. So I think having both that curiosity to learn more and to engage with people that are different from yourself, but also be willing to invite people in and want to share that with people. I think it's easier to just have people come up and ask like, hey, can I come to this? Or hey, can I be a part of this? And it's much harder to be the one to pursue people and to initiate. But I think that's really critical in building intentional communities. After Baylor, thankfully I still live in Waco, so it's not too hard to drive down the road and be a part of the activities here. But I will say that technology has worked wonders, whether it's being a part of, social media. And I think also as Baylor grads, we then pave the way for Asian Americans after us to come. And a lot of times I find that I know students who are now coming to Baylor, and it's great to be able to talk to them and share with them like, these were the things I was a part of. These were the organizations that were a huge blessing to me, and make those connections. But even during COVID, I mean, there were a lot of different Zoom panels. I was a part of one. And I think there was a student who was previously the president of like the Korean Student Association, and he came back and gave a speech at a panel. And I think as each person graduates and becomes a professional in their own field, there are so many opportunities to reconnect with Baylor, whether it's through mentoring people who are now students and learning in that field, or being a part of a panel like this, but also just staying connected on social media, letting people know what all is going on are great ways to stay connected to the community here and come back for homecoming, of course.
Yes, thank you for coming back for the panel. For these next two questions, I wanted to add a little bit of context. So I wanted these to address the fact that, which a lot of people have been alluding to in their answers, that there is just so much diversity within the Asian community. And that almost makes the task of fostering community really difficult. In our collective societal consciousness, there's often one typical Asian prototype that excludes a lot of groups. A study done by researchers at Columbia and the University of California at Riverside found that the default Asian is still East Asian, even though the latter constitutes less than a minority of the racial group. And so Dr. Kumar, I've notably often felt that there's a divide between East Asians and Southeast Asians, and we see that on campus with our organizations, and also just broadly. And so what are some ways that you think that we can foster connectedness across really diverse groups in the diaspora?
Wow, if I had an answer to that question, I think I'd probably write a book about it. One thing that has certainly helped me personally is to simply understand the history behind even the term Asian American. See, the word Asian American didn't even exist in the census forms until UC Berkeley, during the civil rights movement. Right after there was a Black Panther Party that was very active, and so with the Chicano movement that was happening, and some of the large number of Asian Americans who existed on Berkeley campus at that point in time, they simply organized themselves in support of some of the activity related to civil rights movement. And so at that point in time, the whole idea behind was that you just figured out something to organize yourself around, and eventually it largely just became a place where you check the box. So even what you describe as, or what most of us think of as South Asian, there is no Sri Lankan who thinks of herself as, hooray, I'm South Asian. Usually it's just a matter of checking off the box. And same thing is about East Asian, that whether you're Chinese or Japanese, it does not really, East Asian does not really have an identity in that sense. And so a lot of these ideas are, I would say in some ways, as human beings, we all seek some level of status at all points in time in our lives. And we find the one that resonates somehow at that moment, and we stick with it. And so what I have found, for instance, in terms of how you bridge the divide, for instance, I love food. And that's one of the things that last time we talked. And so one of my best friends who happens to be Korean, I was meeting his wife for the first time, and he had told me that she just really made some of the best food. And all I had to do was beg her to make some Korean food, which was better than most of the restaurants I went to. And so I just went and practiced how to say hello and how to say thank you in Korean as much as I could. I still mangled it entirely, but of course I did. And eventually all I did was I said a few garbled words in Korean, and I said, just forgive me, just take this as my token of effort. I just want you to cook some kimchi rice for me. Please do that. And so the point was that it was, and I meant it, it wasn't so much as, but the food sort of gives you a point whereby you can begin to move on from there. And after that, you can start talking about children. You can start talking about parents, and you can start talking about death and life and marriages, all the things that really matter in our lives. Because reality is, all of us have traveled in different places. When you come back, you don't recall the best building which moved you. You recall the best encounters you had with other human beings, stories that you bring with us. And I'll just share this one particular one about how it has played out for me. I was in Tokyo, and I was lost, and because Tokyo is a massive subway system, and I was lost, and I saw a metro police officer who I asked. I wanted to find out which platform did I need to be to catch the particular train, and I went and asked him that if he could help me. And after a while, I realized that his facial expressions, he was shouting at me in Japanese, which I do not understand. And so after a while, I realized that his facial expressions were not very pleasant. And then there was someone else who pointed to me that, he's screaming at you. And I said, why? All I did was ask for where did the train go? And then he said, well, he's thinking that all you stupid foreigners, you all think that we all speak English here in Japan. That's what he was screaming at. And I said, would you please apologize on my behalf? And he apologized. And then right after that, the person who has translated it for me, he pulls up and says, would you mind if we hang out together all day, and so that I can practice my English with you? And we spent all day just walking aimlessly around the streets. And that's one particular experience that remains vivid on my mind. It's nothing else. It was all about human interaction. So what I have found is that when you create organizations because you're seeking status, you have to find the lowest common denominator. And it's often it ends up being based on language, based on how we look, how we present ourselves. But I think we all have to remind ourselves over and over again that what matters at the end of the day is exactly how we feel, how we interact with each other, and the deepest of human emotions we all have, and they are identical regardless of how you look, which language you speak. It doesn't really matter at all.
Right. Oh, wow. Thank you, Dr. Kumar. Jaja, I wanted to ask you a similar question. You recently founded the Asian Leaders Network and have really grouped together a very diverse set of individuals from around Waco. So what do you think are the best ways that we can kind of foster community among the diversity of the diaspora?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of take it even broader than just starting with the Asian diaspora, because kind of what inspired the Asian Leaders Network was actually the work of many others who are part of other ethnic groups outside of Asian American or Pacific Islander. Because here in Waco, as a small business owner, there was no Asian American Chamber of Commerce for us to be involved in as a small business owner. And so we participated in the African American and Hispanic Chamber of Commerce to help network and connect with more small businesses in the community for the last 4 years. And through my participation in the Hispanic Chamber, they had a Hispanic Leaders Network. And the funny story is one of the organizers of HLN, one of their initial kind of lunch meetings, they had made it accidentally public event on Facebook when it was supposed to be private. And this was a few years ago. And then I had seen it and put it in my calendar to go attend the lunch meeting. And then, I'm in this room, everybody's Hispanic. I'm the only non-Hispanic. And one of the organizers like, hey, Jaja, you can stay, you're more than welcome. But just so you know, this was supposed to be for the Hispanic leaders. And we're not sure how you came here. And I said, oh, well, I saw so-and-so post about it. And they're like, oh yeah, we had them take it down immediately because it wasn't supposed to be a public event. But really, that was my first, kind of beginnings of starting to build more community with the HLN group. And from there, they were actually the ones who were like, y'all need to co-create an Asian Leaders Network, and we can help mentor y'all to learn from all of our failures and mistakes so that you can feel confident. And, this was a few years ago, and I was very much kind of resistant to the idea because I was like, oh, I feel like in Waco, it's about 2% Asian. And then I felt kind of like burdened with this idea of, wow, okay, it has to be, all on a few individuals to have to start new things, whether that's a new startup or a new organization. And so it just felt like kind of too daunting or too much. But, I think the hugest thing for me, was realizing, wow, okay, I'm not alone in feeling like, there's more need in the community. And so then gathering other Asian American and Pacific Islander leaders, connecting with them, and starting just with this idea of, okay, here we are. There's no other, entity in Waco as of yet that helps bring Asians together in any form or fashion, outside of like a faith community or Baylor. And so then building those relationships, and then from there, just co-creating a space, and allowing the process to emerge, as opposed to feeling that idea of, okay, we have to have all the plans together before we launch or start. So that has been super huge. Another kind of thing that really has been huge has been just realizing, we have to root it in relationship, right? So instead of getting caught up in worrying about, oh, I don't know about a specific ethnic group or their heritage, or, oh, I'm Taiwanese, and, how am I going to connect with other individuals within the broader Asian diaspora? I'm really starting to see more of the commonalities between folks. That's how I approach even, kind of bridging community across ethnic groups as well, like really focusing on, okay, what are some of the commonalities, right? Because like, for example, realizing I relate so much with so many folks that are Hispanic or Latina or Latino, because so many of them are immigrants, right? So there's that common kind of experience already, or being an immigrant's child, right? Even though it's completely different heritage, but there are actually a lot of similarities as well. And so the same way, within the broad AAPI kind of diaspora, there's so many differences that are unique, but there also are so many similarities and beautiful things that you can relate to within the diaspora as well. And so I think that kind of helps me to feel a bit less worried or nervous about bridging that disconnect. And then last but not least, I think just remembering that, this idea of, as you grow and pay attention to these relationships, that it's going to continue emerging, and just that more will come out of it, and that we don't have to always, know all the answers before we begin that process.
Oh, wow, thank you. Moving on to our last round of questions. So for this question, it really hit me that I made all the questions for this panel, but I'm also just a senior and still 21 and still really learning about what the right questions are to even ask. And so for this one, I had the broad question set out for all of you guys. But essentially the vision behind this question is, how can we better advocate for racial equity for Asians and Asian Americans, keeping in mind that we want to work with other racial groups, but not co-opt their movements, but making sure that our movements are distinct and unique, and really harness these specific aspects that we've been talking about throughout the entire panel. So I know that is a broad question, but I'm sure that you guys have insights on it. I think that we can start with Jaja and then move back this way.
Bring back the mic. Yeah, I was going to share. One of the hugest ways is to just start with organizations or groups that are already doing work in racial equity, right? So a few years ago, I joined the NAACP, and I think I'm the only Asian in the NAACP as a member too, but it's a mostly Black organization, right? And they engage in a lot of civic engagement and like voter registration. And just passionate about ensuring that there's a right to vote. And so I joined because of a desire to really want to learn from folks, and then also wanting to just increase my own, engagement and commitment to civic engagement, and not just taking that right to vote for granted, especially as I was learning at that time as a young adult about just all the people and groups that came before us in America to be able to fight for that right to vote. Right. And so I would say, wanting to increase racial equity, don't just be like, okay, well, I don't know where to begin. So I'll just kind of not really consider the fact that, oh, actually there's maybe already an organization or group or person who's already doing the work that you might be interested in. And so then it's starting to join alongside that group or organization or persons and to learn from them. And so that's how we can prevent co-opting of work, in the sense of you come alongside folks that are already doing amazing work, and then partner together, collaborate or work together, right? And so then since then, the relationship with the NAACP has just continued growing. In fact, to the point where even I was kind of running late to coming to this panel because one of the individuals who does a lot of civic engagement work, who's also African-American, was just driving by on her way back from Dallas. And she was calling me just an hour ago, hey, we want to support y'all's small business, but then also encourage folks to go vote tomorrow. How can we partner together to come up with a creative giveaway or something? And so then, those are all the creative things that can come out of these relationships. But I think it's funny because, a few years ago, I would never have anticipated that me just wanting to learn more would have landed me to be here, in the sense of having different relationships with folks who now we can call each other up and be like, okay, this is a creative event we can do, or this is what we can use, as a way to get the word out about registering folks to vote or whatnot.
Thank you, Georgia. On that note, tomorrow is election day. So to answer my own question, a way that we can advocate for racial equity is making sure that we're civically engaged. And if you're a Baylor student, there are shuttles to the poll. And if you need more information about that, you can come ask me after. Sorry to break the flow of the panel, but Dr. Kumar, if you would answer the same question.
So I'm a city planner by trade. And so when I hear the word equity, the first thing that comes to my mind is the years of disinvestment in disadvantaged community based on infrastructure investment money that has gone in. And so what immediately comes to our mind is, in case of Waco, the East Waco area that has been largely African-American. And even today, when you look at the level of infrastructure, it is remarkably poor. But equity also works in a bunch of different ways. So there is another issue right now. Supreme Court is hearing the case about affirmative action. And with the affirmative action, that's a completely different level of discussion we have about equity and how equity plays a role in our society. But at the heart of it is still the benefit and cost that are distributed across different groups. That's what we are really talking about when we say equity. And so the way I see is that there are two ways to do this. One is that one can take this as an important direct benefit cost distribution. You look at where the investments have been, where we have disadvantaged community because of those decisions we have made, and then we need to actually go back in time. And in fact, we can't go back in time, and so we try to make the effort of correcting some of those mistakes that have been made. But then the other part of equity is really that is moving forward. So when we move forward to the future, how do we do this? So one of the federal programs right now is about reconnecting communities. And the idea is that a lot of bridges, highways have disconnected, especially disadvantaged communities have been disproportionately harmed through our infrastructure investment. And so under that program, we're supposed to go back and fix it, but you can't. In fact, in most cases, most of those communities disappeared almost 25, 30 years ago. So you can't really magically bring the communities back. But what you can do is try to come up with an entirely different decision-making process with which you can address them for future generations. So that's one side of it. And what we call typically the spatial equity, in which we know which areas are which communities are disadvantaged have been disadvantaged in their investment decision. But then there is also this idea about temporal or vertical equity, in which we try to figure out a lot of our ideas about sustainability, ideas about climate change. They, in fact, are directly address this idea that whatever we consume today, it really needs to make sure that it does not take away from the future generation. And that's how you understand the temporal equity. And so what we have to do is think of all of this equity is not a single unidimensional concept in which we can say, you take action X and somehow it is more equitable than action Y. In most cases, it has so many different layers, so many different dimensions that we need to be addressing them even in more nuance, more detail than what we actually have been. And I'll just leave you with this. So right after Supreme Court, on the first day of hearing on the affirmative action case, there was one article which basically argued from an Indian American perspective. And their argument was that my parents suffered quite a bit. And with the current situation, they were filing on behalf of the plaintiff, the FY, the Friends of Asian American group that has brought the lawsuit. And their argument was that this is a way to privilege one type of experience as part of the diversity at the cost of everyone else's. And what they implied was that it meant that Asian American experiences were not being privileged and they were being sacrificed in favor of experiences of African American students. And then the second part, there was another article that came out, which was basically arguing that no, Asian American students actually tend to get preferential treatments early on in their life. So in fact, it happens at the very earliest stages of high school itself, when we have recorded data that African American students and Hispanic students, they're typically discouraged from taking advanced level courses. Asian American students tend to be encouraged to take those courses. And so there is quite a bit of, so when you look at equity, then it begins to look very different compared to which group of students are you talking about at what point in time. And so what I'll leave you with this is that equity is not as simple as we make it out to be. It is a remarkably profound concept, and it will behoove all of us to think of it with this great diversity of understanding of equity itself and try to address whenever we think it's lacking.
Thank you. Jamie?
I think one thing that's really great about this current generation is the amount of information that we have access to with the internet, with social media, and the way that voices can be heard across a variety of platforms. And so I think there is also strength in being together, gathering in numbers, and letting your voice be heard. But also being really careful with social media. There's a lot of misinformation that can go on, or you can feel really bogged down from reading so much negative news all the time. I know that's something that I sometimes struggle with, but finding ways to take the information that you have and actually convert it into change and action. And one thing that I've recently personally been learning is just to remind myself that what we see in our past is not necessarily what is to come in the future. And that gives me a lot of hope on ways that we can be creative about advocating for Asian Americans and for other minorities. And one small example is actually recently, Jaja and I have been getting together and talking about like, why is there no BIPOC market that happens to specifically highlight people of color in their businesses in Waco? We're like, well, then let's make one happen. So we actually are co-hosting a holiday market on December 10th for Black, Indigenous, and people of color businesses in Waco. And so even just like small little things like that, like we're just going to create a space for these individuals to shine and hope that the community shows up. But this first step is hopefully the step leading to many other opportunities for these businesses in Waco to really flourish. And so get creative. I think also advocacy doesn't always have to feel like heavy and hard, although a lot of times it is hard changes that are being made. It can also be surrounded around your passions. Like, I just love to create art and I loved boba and I love to talk to people. So let's make a fun holiday event out of it. But at the same time, provide these opportunities that hopefully will really lead to this being an annual event and for lasting change for people to have opportunities like this.
Well, I will see you at that event then.
I think just to add on to what my fellow panelists have already said, I think there's a lot of focus on that sustainability and how to make whatever equity efforts that we actually engage in or whatever we're starting to be longstanding and make sure that it can actually have a lasting impact on the community. I think a lot of that comes with the storytelling and remembering what are we doing this for? And I think a lot of that can kind of be mixed in with the in the rush of things. We're saying, you know, we got to get Asians together, but I think we have to remember also and take a step back and remember the why and remember who are the people that we're helping? What is the gap that we're filling? And what is the need that exists in the community? And I think that's really important to kind of always take that step back and not get kind of too bogged down in the details. And I'll give you an example of that. So I volunteered as an attorney at the Chinatown Pro Bono Legal Clinic in Chicago. And so part of that was we'd meet one Saturday a month and we'd talk to clients in the community. And we had law students come in, they would help us with the translation and helped us do the intake, but they also sat in with the clients and they were able to hear the stories of the clients who said, I can't find a forum or an attorney to talk to me that speaks my language. And I can't even get into court to do this very simple thing. I can't access justice for an eviction matter, a collections matter, or a divorce matter. And being able to have the next generation kind of hear those stories firsthand from people who have experienced what it's like or the detriment of not having the services or the even whatever it is, the access to the community, I think is really important so that the next generation can understand why do we need this and what happens when it doesn't exist and what happens to our community when we don't give them available resources. And so I think just my general takeaway would be remember to take that step back.
Wow, thank you. I think since we have a little extra time, I'd like to open the floor up to maybe 1 or 2 questions from people in the audience, if you have any. Yes.
I guess it's somewhat legal based also. You get all of your part of that story. How we do kind of believe in making where Asian stories are more and more bringing to the nation. But at the same time, you have Asian Americans who've been scapegoated for coronavirus, for example. The other community from the action cases there that I think is being weaponized and all more than the way, for example, the bill is stubbornly system. So how do we sort of fight that?
I'll share the answer to that through another story in the sense of, you know, I think, especially here in Waco, I realized more and more just how so much of the disconnect, even between different ethnic groups, is a lack of understanding between our differences in culture, right? Because I mentioned that my involvements with the NAACP, and through that was able to start to build more relationships with Black folks in Waco, long time, you know, Wacoans. And then for many individuals, you know, as we built relationships, some even came up to me and told me they thought Asians was white, right? And I've had multiple folks who actually shared that with me. And in the sense of, you know, with the rise of anti-Asian racism in the midst of COVID-19 pandemic, folks, you know, not realizing, like, as our business was trying to like kind of amplify more stories about anti-Asian racism and raise awareness about it. Some of those folks were sharing like, wow, I didn't realize that Asian Americans are considered a person of color. And you see that actually a lot in Instagram or social media, Facebook, wherever. If you look under comments, when we're talking about like BIPOC folks or people of color, sometimes a lot of the conversation or dialogue is a surprise that Asians are people of color, right? And I think part of that is because of that just the model minority myth and all of the stereotypes that Asian could be seen as, East Asian and all these different things that we had talked about today. And then the other part is, just a lack of understanding of how diverse the Asian diaspora is. And then ultimately for me and those individuals, it went back to there's a disconnect and lack of relationship, and then through bridging that disconnect in relationship and dialogue, we were able to then both realize, oh, this individual was taught that, and then they were able to then update their information over time. But then they also shared about their experience, experiencing segregation as a child and what that meant as a Black individual in the civil rights kind of era, right? And so there's just so many ways that we each can learn, from each other as we build those relationships. And then not to kind of blame each other, but to realize oh, wow, we were on both sides, kind of pitted against each other, right? It wasn't because they intentionally was just trying to be ignorant. They literally haven't really had that many relationships with Asians, right? And then for me on my end, starting to learn from their perspective, their experience as well, the things that I haven't realized or haven't known, especially growing up more so, middle class, for example. And so I'm not sure if that kind of answers your question, but it kind of starts that dialogue there.
I think I'll just add that there is no answer. I don't think there is an answer to your question. All we need to remind ourselves is that all we know for a fact is that we need to stay humble and keep looking all the time for answer to exactly those questions. And it's in the process of looking that we begin to understand. And one of my favorite authors who has helped me sort of put a lot of this very precisely is J. Caspian Kang. And I think you probably have read some of it because your question sort of reflects the question that he directly struggles with. And one of the frameworks that he has tried to address, not so much as debunk or support, is this idea that a lot of Asian Americans, their idea of progress itself is largely trying to achieve some degree of whiteness. And it's through that lens that they view progress, and even their decision-making process. But it's not that simple, and he argues that quite significantly too. And a lot of data we begin to see now, we're starting to see, for instance, that when you look at the income diversity among Asian American, it's the highest among any other group that has a census box attached to it. An average household income for Indian American is about 120,000, and for an average household income for a Burmese household is barely 40,000. So there is a very wide variation among the ethnic groups itself. And so what some of the issues related to politicizing these identities and playing identity politics, look, we have been playing those games forever in this country, in every country for that matter. So that's not new. What is new is how effective some of that has been, in which we forget that at the end of the day, none of us go to bed thinking about that politics. It's really the human experience we had that particular day that stays with us for the night. And then the next morning when we wake up not because there's a political agenda in front of us, but we wake up because there's a life to live. And that's what connects us all together. And that's how, in some ways, that's what I hold on to. So in fact, we are all seeing the same level of anxiety, but we have to figure out not only how we deal with it, but most importantly, just keep reminding ourselves over and over again that, those different arguments, a lot of them make sense and they are completely contradict each other. But I must say that I have really enjoyed how J. Caspian Kang has been struggling with these questions, and he has tried to sort of make it a little more nuanced and a little better understanding.
Since we opened this to the audience, you all don't have to answer, but if you'd like to, feel free.
I can only speak to what I personally can think of. And I think for each individual, it really varies on what spheres of influence you're in. I think, you know, for big national civic change that we want to see, those things obviously take a lot of time, but they're also made up out of a lot of individuals doing their part in their communities. For me, I'm an educator and also an artist, and a lot of times those things lend themselves to making a difference. With education, I teach at a predominantly white middle school, and I really think I'm like the first Asian a lot of these kids have seen in their lives. It's just 15 minutes down the road from here. So in that sphere of influence that I have, I do really try to have intentional conversations with these students. And just, I mean, the misinformation that spreads out there is just wild. And us, you know, with COVID and all of these things that were going around. But I think for these students to be like, oh, like my teacher is Chinese and like she's not necessarily the one who started COVID. Like even just to have an individual that they could connect with and see that those myths or those stories aren't actually true is helpful. And then with art, like there's such a platform to combat these false narratives that are being spread, like with COVID and then with the rise in Asian hate crimes. So many things came up during that time with like hate is a virus or things like that, that artists really were able to use their platform to share that and then, you know, tell the deeper meaning behind that and use that as a form of education for people. So whatever your sphere of influence is, I encourage y'all to find the little ways that in your daily life, because we can, you know, be a part of the big movements and the big changes, but also just in your everyday life, the ways that you can battle against these narratives that aren't true do make more difference than you might think.
And I will just say very similarly, I think it's easy to want to give up, and it's like, and just kind of throw in the towel and say, you know, Waco is only 2% Asian. So what are we going to do? How are we ever going to change the public perception based on a very small percentage of the community? And I just think that we have to have that kind of perseverance. And again, going back to why we're doing this and be able to show that it really matters and it can really make a difference, because people within the community you have to start change from somewhere. And as Jamie said, you just say, well, I'm not going to be the person that will make any kind of difference. I will never change anyone's mind. I think that's the first step in saying we're not going to be able to do anything. And even very similarly at the law school, I'm the only Asian American professor. And I think I am the only Asian American professor in the law school's history. So sorry, not like that, but I think it is. But I think something like that, it could be very easy to say, like, it's not, whatever, I'll just sit here and I won't do anything or say anything, or I'll just kind of let misperceptions fly, or whatever students come to say, or whatever perceptions that people have of Asians just generally can just be there. But I think it's really important that we don't just throw in the towel, and we do try to make a difference. We do try to reach out. I appreciate our 2 law students coming here for this today for that reason. But I think, again, just making sure that you still, going back to what I said earlier, reach out that hand, kind of just keep letting people know about opportunities, and letting people, and just making those small connections so that people have positive associations instead of just kind of throwing in the towel. And it doesn't even have to necessarily be about race. You don't have to bring that into the conversation. You can just be a good person, be you, and then people can observe that you are a great person. You're a great leader, and be that kind of role model. And you never know kind of what impact that might have on someone who is just having a daily conversation with you, even if you can take that kind of extra few minutes to make that effort.
Thank you. Well, I've certainly learned a lot from this panel, and I'm sure all of you guys have too. So would everyone join me in giving our panelists another round of applause? With that, I will hand it over to Camille.
Thank you again to our panel, Jaja, Dr. Kumar, Jamie, Dr. Tang, for taking time out and sharing with us and encouraging us to keep going and build relationships and come together to help one another. Again, we've recorded this evening's panel and we'll post that later on this week on YouTube. Thank you again for joining us this evening, and we hope you'll join us for our next event. Have a great evening.